Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Over the last few weeks I've been working on a special project photographing paradise rifle birds displaying in various locations over the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. And photographing these birds reminded me how important it is to understand and control exposure. However, getting the perfect exposure in the field isn't always easy, and there are many different ways of getting there. It goes all the way from the program mode where the camera does everything for you to the full manual mode where the photographer does it all. Personally, I like full manual mode because it gives me full control over the look of my images by setting aperture, shutter speed and ISO myself. But it takes time to master and you definitely need fast fingers on the dials, so it's definitely not for everyone, especially when the light changes a lot, because you have to constantly monitor the histogram or the exposure simulation in the viewfinder to make sure that you're not clipping the highlights or underexposing the dark areas of your photos. Normally, I like to expose as far to the right as possible without clipping the highlights. That's why I watch the histogram and make sure that there's a little gap on the right-hand side of the histogram. So that means that I have as much information as possible in my file without losing any detail in those precious highlights. When it comes to controlling the exposure and the look of our images in the field, we have three variables that we can set. Firstly, the aperture that allows us to control how much depth of field our images have and how blurry our background is behind the subject. So if we set a large aperture like f2.8, we have very shallow depth of field with a quite blurry background. And if we set a small aperture like f11 for instance, a lot of our subject will be in focus, which can be great for small birds, but also a lot more background elements will be visible. Secondly, we set the shutter speed. This is very important because we want to make sure that our images don't have a lot of motion blur and are nice and sharp. So I like to set not too low shutter speeds and keep it above like a 400 to 1000 of the second, ideally to make sure that all the images are sharp and all the action is nice and frozen. Aperture and shutter speed are the most important elements because they allow us to control the look of the image and make sure that the photo is nice and sharp by selecting a high enough shutter speed. And the third element, the ISO, is basically there to support the first two elements. And we select it high enough, or let the camera select it high enough, that we get a nice and balanced exposure with the settings that we've dialed in for the shutter speed and the aperture. Each one of the different camera modes available to us allows us to set a different amount of these three variables in our camera. It goes from the full automatic mode, where we don't select anything, to full manual, where we select all three variables ourselves. The more we do ourselves, of course, the more we can influence the image look and make sure that we get nice and sharp, not too noisy images with a not too busy background. While I believe that full manual mode is the ultimate way to control your camera, I totally understand that it's not for everyone because it's a lot of work and you have to constantly monitor all the settings to make sure that you get the right exposure. The next best thing to full manual mode is actually to stay in manual mode, but let the camera select the ISO rather than inputting the ISO ourselves. That allows us to still stay in control of the most valuable variables, the shutter speed to make sure it's high enough to get nice and sharp photos, and the aperture to control the image look and the depth of field in our photos. And because modern camera bodies allow us to use quite a large ISO range, including quite high ISOs, using auto ISO has become quite a viable option in the field. It's not real manual mode anymore because ultimately we let the camera decide the exposure rather than deciding it ourselves, but it takes a lot of stress out of it for us in the field because we don't have to constantly monitor the settings anymore. If now the light is suddenly changing, the camera will just automatically adjust the ISO to a higher or lower value, still giving us a good exposure without us personally having to change any settings on the camera. So for most people, that's quite a relief knowing that whenever something suddenly changes, they don't actually have to change anything and still get a very presentable result. When I'm photographing birds, I usually like to set my aperture to anywhere between f5.6 to f11 to have enough depth of field on the bird, for instance, to not only have the head sharp, but also get the feet and the tail sharp. And I like to use shutter speeds from like a 400 to 500th of a second and up for perched birds, and something like a 2500th of a second for birds in flight. And just like it's important to learn to get the perfect exposure in the field, it's also important that you learn how to edit your images to perfection. And I know I can help you a lot with that with my masterclass and my PROSETS. With my PROSETS, I allow you with just one click to transform your raw files to get great colors and a great looking exposure. And in my masterclass, I teach you step by step everything you need to know in Photoshop to get amazing results, like using a liquefier, curves layers, adjustment layers, selective color layers, and so much more. So if you want me to help you to get better results, make sure to check out my masterclass and PROSETS down there in the description. So we're all set now with manual mode and ISO in the field and don't have to worry about exposure anymore at all? Well, not so fast. There's definitely situations where manual and auto ISO reaches its limits, and usually that happens when the lighting situations are quite extreme or you try to create a certain image look. For instance, you're on a bright beach and there's a few clouds overhead and you're photographing relatively wide open at, let's say, f5.6 and have a not too high shutter speed of like an 800th of a second, and that gives you an auto ISO value of like 200. But what happens now if suddenly the sun comes out and your whole scene becomes a lot brighter? In this case, you will likely end up with a lot of overexposed images because the auto ISO range of your camera is almost maxed out to the lower end already. So with the sun coming out and the scene getting really bright, your camera will go to the lowest ISO value, which is usually 100, but that will likely be not dark enough to actually balance out your other settings and you end up with a lot of too bright images. The opposite can happen if you're in a dark rainforest and you've dialed in a too high shutter speed, let's say a 500th of a second, but it's pretty dark. In this case, the camera will try to max out the auto ISO range to the high end, but it might still not be able to actually give you an adequate exposure with the highest ISO setting that you allow in the auto ISO range, and you end up with a lot of too dark underexposed images. In these extreme scenarios where you max out the auto ISO range either to the high end or the low end, you won't be able to get a correct exposure in the field without also changing either the shutter speed or the aperture or both. Now this sounds like a big issue at first, but I suppose these scenarios don't happen all the time, and with modern mirrorless cameras with electronic viewfinders, it has actually become a lot easier to monitor these things because we have a histogram displayed in the viewfinder and we also have the exposure simulation in the viewfinder. So normally you should notice very quickly if your images all look too dark or too bright in the viewfinder. However, sometimes this can still be tricky to see and we have to rely on the histogram to make sure the images are not too over or underexposed. With DSLR cameras, on the other hand, this is a lot harder and you basically have to take test shots and then review them on the back of the camera and also looking at the histogram on the back of the camera to make sure that your settings are right when the light changes a lot. Another potential issue is that when using manual mode on auto ISO is that you end up shooting with very high ISOs constantly, even on a nice and sunny day. And this can happen if you dial in quite a small aperture, let's say f8 or f11, and a very high shutter speed like a 2000th of a second or 4000th of a second. And now it might get a little bit darker or you go to a slightly darker place, and suddenly these settings require the camera to use a very high ISO, and you might end up shooting at 25,600 ISO on a nice and sunny day simply because the aperture and the shutter speed you've dialed in are a little bit too extreme for these situations. So whenever we're using manual mode and auto ISO, we have to make sure to not get too lazy and fully rely on the camera's auto ISO range, so we don't end up shooting at too high ISO on a bright and sunny day. Our cameras always want to give us a balanced exposure, which can create a bit of a challenge when using manual mode on auto ISO if there's a few bright or few dark elements in our images. If you're photographing on a bright beach or in the snow, for instance, you will likely get too underexposed and kind of dark looking images. And if you're in a dark environment, you often end up with like a sort of washed out gray looking image rather than a nice and black and crisp looking image. Extreme lighting situations definitely challenge the more automatic camera modes a bit more, and manual mode and auto ISO is definitely no exception. One common problem you may come across is that you're photographing a very dark colored bird against a bright background. So in this case, if I let the camera control the exposure by itself without interfering, I will end up with a severely underexposed bird because the background is so bright. Luckily, in these cases, we have a little helper available called the exposure compensation. It basically allows us to tell the camera, based on its original exposure, that we either want to over or underexpose our scene, allowing us to gain a little bit more control over the whole situation. So we are still setting the aperture and the shutter speed and let the camera control the ISO with the auto ISO function. But now we also have our little helper, the exposure compensation, that allows us to influence how bright or dark our exposure turns out. So if we're photographing on a bright beach or in the snow and we look at the histogram and see there's a big gap on the right hand side, so we're underexposing all our images, we can now dial in a positive exposure compensation of like +1 or +2 in extreme cases, and now get a brighter photo and a better exposure overall. And the same is true if we're seeing that it looks too bright and too washed out. I can dial in a negative exposure compensation and now get a better exposed image that has nicer and darker blacks. If you find yourself in an extreme situation where it feels like you're constantly fighting what the camera is doing via the exposure compensation, it may be best to bite the bullet and switch over to the full manual mode, because you gain full control and you can stop the camera to kind of doing the wrong thing that you then have to correct via the exposure compensation. There's another thing I would do in an extreme example, and that is to develop the RAW file twice in the editing process. I would use the RAW file once and make sure that there's all the detail in the bird, but then the background is likely a bit blown out. So I'd grab the RAW file again, open it up again, but this time pull down the highlights, pull down the exposure a bit, making sure that my background looks alright as well. And then I can open both of these files in Photoshop, put the layers on top of each other, and then use the layer mask to bring back the background and make sure that the background also doesn't look too bright, giving me a nice and balanced image from the one RAW file, but developing it twice. And these things is exactly what I teach you in my masterclass. I still believe that for most photographers, the ultimate goal should be to understand and master the full manual mode. But I also realize that it's not everyone's cup of tea. And in these cases, I think manual mode and auto ISO is the best of the rest of all the other camera modes, because it still allows you to input the two most important variables, the shutter speed and the aperture, while still giving you a great exposure most of the time. Now, it comes with its own challenges, but especially in difficult lighting situations, it can be very helpful to get a good exposure without having to change all the settings on the camera all the time. So what's your favorite camera mode? Are you shooting full manual, manual with auto ISO, aperture priority, or maybe FV mode where you can kind of change everything? Make sure to let me know in the comments. Hit that like button for the video, and if you want to support me directly, also make sure to check out my channel membership, and of course, hit that subscribe button down there, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.